What a treat to be joined for the second time on Bad Faith podcast by Marc Lamont Hill, author, television personality, professor of media studies and urban education at Temple University. Welcome back to the pod.
It is a pleasure to come back. I don't get invited back many places, so this is like a big deal to me.
I know that's not true, Marc.
Look, you'd be surprised.
I mean, look, the background to that comment is I wouldn't necessarily be surprised because you've been what many have called a truth teller for your entire career. And a lot of folks, including myself, think that you were unfairly let go from your political commentary gig at CNN because of statements that you made that were critical of Israel. And we talked about those the last time that you were on the show. You know, since we last spoken, I've been through my own gamut of critique about this issue with my employment at The Hill and a whole kerfuffle that happened with a regular correspondent at The Hill being let go for what she perceived to be, and I agree, objection to the nature of the commentary that she had about the state of Israel's behavior toward Palestinians. She is Jewish herself. It's been a whole thing. We don't need to revisit it. But you being such a truth teller and being someone who was so committed ideologically and principally to having a difficult conversations like this one is exactly why I wanted to have you on today to discuss all of the business that's been going on with various people, principally Kanye West and Kyrie Irving.
Yes.
And this Black Israelite conversation. And the reason I wanted to talk to you is that as a Black person who has a passing familiarity with the Black Israelites, it became very clear as I'm watching the media talk about it that my kind of understanding of what they were all about wasn't quite aligning with how the movement, if you want to call it that, was being characterized in the media and what the kind of like pulls and pushes were there and why it was appealing to figures like Kanye West and Kyrie Irving to begin with. So let's start there. You tweeted earlier this month. The moment is so ripe with possibility for richly and deeply discussing Black-Jewish relations in the U.S., Hebrew Israelite traditions, Black Jewry, anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, etc. It's frustrating to see it squandered by anti-intellectualism, disinformation, and demagoguery. What do you mean by that?
There's one, well, let me take a step back. When the Kanye West conversation happened, there was uniform sort of condemnation nearly in the public sphere for what Kanye West said from the moment he Instagrammed a message to Diddy about Jewish people.
Saying when that Diddy was being controlled by Jewish people.
Exactly. And once he said that Diddy was being controlled by Jewish people, and then he said, I'm going to and when Chappelle had a bit on it, but this whole thing, like I'm going to bed, but when I wake up, I'm going DEFCON 3 on Jews, which is an awful commentary, right? It was just bizarre that he went to sleep. It's like most people would. It's that I think you kind of tweet and go to sleep, which was Chappelle's point.
Vaguely, I remember it started with a tweet, strange tweet. It was like, I'm feeling a little sleepy. I'm gonna give me some rest, but when I wake up, I'm gonna go DEFCON 3 on the Jews. And then he just went to bed.
You gotta have nerves to steal a tweet. A lot of things can go to sleep, much less something as virulent as that. Yeah,
exactly. And most of us were outraged and disturbed by it. And from there, Kanye continued to double down, triple down. He did interviews with folk. It started with Fox News prior to that, where they kind of strategically cut around some of the more extreme things that Kanye said.
The Tucker Carlson interview.
The Tucker Carlson interview.
Planned Parenthood was made by Margaret Sanger, a known eugenics with the KKK, to control the Jew population. When I say Jew, I mean the 12 lost tribes of Judah, the blood of Christ, who the people known as the race Black really are. This is who our people are, the blood of Christ. This, as a Christian, is my belief.
And then He did one with Chris Cuomo. He did one with Piers Morgan. And with each subsequent interview, it seemed that he became more unabashed in his anti-Semitism. And it was quite disturbing to see and to hear. So that was the easy part, though.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by easy is it was easy to point out Kanye West's anti-Semitism. He is, he's going straight from like the protocols the elders of Zion. He's doing straight Nazi talking points. He's doing the most common anti-Semitic tropes and canards. I mean, this wasn't sophisticated. This isn't like Trump anti-Semitism. This wasn't white evangelicals, sort of having an anti-Semitic subtext. This wasn't, Trump talking about who controls the banks. This wasn't, some of the campaign literature we saw on the right wing where they would have, kind of Jewish people or people in the world of finance and in economics who happen to be Jewish and try to make some kind of connection. Like it didn't require any brain power to see how anti-Semitic Kanye West was being.
I've said it, the most Nazi-like activities I've seen, and the Nazis, in my view, were thugs that shook people down, did a lot of really bad things.
But they did good things too. We're going to stop dissing the Nazis all the time.
Okay, we're going to get to that.
But there was another conversation that we could have been having at the same time. Kanye West, a few years ago, when he broke up with Amber Rose more than a few years ago, said, I had to take a bunch of showers, like 1,000 showers after dating her. Right?
Yeah, I remember that.
It was gross, right? What he said it was misogynistic. It was anti-Black. I mean, particularly in the context of leaving this Black woman for this non-Black woman, right? I mean, there was also the subtext about her not being clean for all these other reasons there's a whole complicated way to talk about patriarchy and sexism, misogyny and misogynoir. But the point is, we didn't talk about it. We said, oh, that's Ye. Ye says slavery, that sounds like a choice to me. And we were a little upset. But then folk went to Wyoming. They went to Sunday service in California. They bought Donda. They continued to support Kanye West, even in his absurdities. When he was stalking, very publicly to me, harassing and stalking, nearly stalking. Let me say this. He was harassing and what appeared to be close to stalking Kim Kardashian. We weren't appalled at this kind of display of violence when he's wearing a White Lives Matter shirt. People were outraged, but the level of outrage was very much on the social media tip, right? It was about what we said. It wasn't about what we did. There's a huge difference between the immediate shutdown of Kanye West in terms of his bank, in terms of his job opportunities, in terms of his brand relationships, in terms of his representation. All of it went away, right? As it should have, right? Mm-hmm. Because he said something awful and people organized against him, right? And it wasn't just Jewish people. A lot of us organized and said, you know what, Kanye shouldn't have a platform here. Kanye shouldn't be on Twitter doing this. He's inciting violence. He just tweeted a swastika. Kanye West shouldn't be there. I don't want to buy this sneaker if Kanye West is representing. A lot of people said this, but certainly powerful industry execs said this isn't a good look for us. And again, it wasn't just Jewish people. It was all kinds of folk. Not an issue for me. The issue is we didn't have the same sort of outrage. We didn't have the same capacity to organize and hold Kanye accountable for anti-Blackness or for misogyny, for anything else. And there were people who were trying to have that conversation. But on the one hand, people were ignoring that. And I'm just going to say this one thing. There were some people who were ignoring the voices saying that. And then some of the loudest voices saying, hey, what about this anti-Blackness over here? We're also anti-Semitic. And so it was a very complicated map because some of the people saying, well, Kanye did a lot of messed up stuff. He has lyrics about this and statements about that. The problem is they were also making it sound like it was some Jewish conspiracy as opposed to a much more reasonably explainable problem. So that's just one example of how we could have had an interesting conversation. And instead we had a very flat one.
So some people would argue, there's two immediate issues that pop up in my head. One is that when we talk about who's objecting and who was mad and who wanted to have a conversation, who didn't, it's very difficult to pin any of that down, right? Obviously, when Kanye West said that slavery was a choice, it was principally, perhaps basically exclusively black people who were very mad at that. And I'm sure there are some Black people who either never were going to buy a Yeezy shoe, or they stopped buying their Yeezys, or they put them in the closet and didn't want to wear them anymore. And there were other people who chose differently. Just like today, I'm sure there are a lot of people of all racial and religious backgrounds who continue to put on College Dropout and haven't pulled it out of their playlists and haven't thrown away their attire and are going to keep on keeping on.
Right.
And some people would say that given that how difficult it is to really say, who felt what in what proportion at what time from what groups, the real factor here is the ability to actually hold someone accountable and whether or not you are in a position to actually confront Kanye where it hurts in terms of his contracts and deals, his ability to bank. JP Morgan basically debanked, whatever phrase that Kanye keeps using, he got debanked from JP Morgan. And some people might say, well, is the issue that Black people weren't mad enough or Black people didn't want to have a conversation when it was about talking about their own, Kanye's insults of their own people, or that women weren't mad enough when he was saying misogynistic things about Kim Kardashian or Amber Rose? Or is it simply that Black people aren't powerful enough to actually crack the whip? That's not the best phrase I could use, but aren't powerful
right.
enough to actually exert real control over him in a way that would ultimately shut him up.
So I think I agree that there's some truth to that, but that presumes that we're not accountable for each other, right? So in other words, Ari Emanuel sends out a letter and urges people not to do business with Kanye West because of his vicious anti-Semitism. Ari Emanuel was correct. Ari Emanuel could have sent that letter out because of his anti-Black statements. If instead of saying slavery was a choice, he'd said the Holocaust was a choice, corporations would have had a very different response. So I think it's up to Black people to take care of Black people, but I also think it's up to our allies, not just Jewish people, all allies, all of humanity, to stand with us. Similarly, those of us who still rock Yeezy and listen to College Dropout after he makes anti-Semitic comments, that's also a problem. We have to be accountable to each other and for each other. As far as the question of institutional power, I think that it is more difficult for Black people to, at the level of taking away a job from Kanye or at the level of debanking him. Most people can't do that, right? However, Tekashi 6ix9ine doesn't get mainstream support the way he used to. Corporations aren't throwing money at Tekashi anymore, even though he has a huge social media following. Why? Because he's a snitch. He's a rat.
Wait, I'm sorry. What did Tekashi 6ix9ine do? I'm deeply uncool, Marc. So I don't follow all of the things.
Tekashi 6ix9ine was incarcerated a few years ago, and the reason he got out early, which was right near the beginning of the pandemic, was because he told on people. Now, there's a lot of reasons not to like it. Again, a lot of reasons not to like Tekashi 6ix9ine. There's sexual assault allegations. There's stuff with underage girls. There's all kinds of allegations and stories. He's said and done awful things. But the thing that got him his name dirty in the streets was because he was snitching on people. And he got he had a bid of like a very long bid, and he came home in a matter of months, basically because he snitched. Rappers don't stand next to him. Nobody will do a feature with him. He can't get a major label record deal. He can't do all these other things. Why? Because he's a snitch. So what I'm saying is Black people have the capacity, and artists have the capacity to marginalize somebody when they care about the thing. If Kanye West had been had come out as gay, I suspect nobody would be going down to Wyoming. I suspect.
Do you really think that's true in today's era? I mean, Kanye was the guy who made kind of soft. I mean, I'm about to use a lot of reductive terms, but kind of like that soft rap. I'm wearing a Argyle shirt. I mean, that wearing an Argyle shirt for a rapper in 2007 was the equivalent of Harry Styles wearing a dress today. I mean, it felt like a radical departure from, norms of heteronormativity,
In a way, but he still performed a certain kind of masculinity. It was a preppy masculinity. It was a complicated one, but he still was he clearly marked himself as heterosexual, and he still was willing to make songs that were misogynistic. But, you know what I mean? But either way, it's one thing to say that there's room for complex gender performance, like a Young Thug, right? That's true. Mm-hmm. But an actual straight out gay rapper, I'm not sure we have the capacity for it. But even if the fans do, my point is a lot of other rappers wouldn't. The same rappers that still went down to Wyoming when he said slavery is a choice, some of those same rappers, I guarantee you, Gucci.
But Marc, Lil Nas X is out here in these streets doing very well for himself. Wasn't it like album of the year last year?
But he's making Yes, but if you look at the community that's supporting him, it's not mainstream rappers. He's not
What
getting
about
features.
the bunny one? Sorry.
You talking about Bad
Bad
Bunny?
Bunny. Didn't he just kiss a guy on an award
Yeah,
stage during a performance?
But again, mainstream rappers and the mainstream hip hop community isn't what makes him fill stadiums. But my point isn't that there isn't an appetite for a queer artist. My point is that there's a way that the hip hop community made a very specific choice to marginalize certain people. If somebody's accused of being a snitch, suddenly it's very difficult for them to have a successful rap career. Whereas if they're queer, I'm sorry, if they're anti-Black and they say something misogynistic or patriarchal, they say something, whatever, like we kind of let that go. I'm saying we have priorities too. And I'm saying we could make one of our priorities to organize against artists who say things that are anti-Black. I'll give you another example. Chrisette Michele. Chrisette Michele, Chrisette Michele can't get it.
I was about to say, I haven't heard Chrisette Michelle's name since like 2010. Remind me what she did again? What was her issue?
She sang at Trump's inauguration.
Oh, right.
And Black people were like, we're good. Now, I don't think that happens, one, if she's a man. I don't think that happens, two, if we liked her music more. So again, we make choices. All I'm saying is we make choices too. So it's not, I think there's an argument that we don't have the institutional power to impose some of our outrage in the same kind of systemic structural ways that other people do. But I think it's also that we don't organize ourselves. I mean, I could say to my Jewish brothers and sisters, yeah, I want y'all to organize with me against Kanye when he says anti-Black shit, but they would rightly say, and some have literally said to me, yeah, but y'all didn't do it. Y'all were still going down to Wyoming. Y'all were still making albums with Kanye. Y'all were still buying.
Who is the y'all? I mean, this was the first point of my like two-pronged objection.
Yeah.
Who is the y'all? I wasn't at Wyoming. You weren't out in Wyoming. A very small cohort of insiders was at Wyoming. So if the argument is that...
But they're buying the album. They're buying Don. I mean, like what I'm saying is people are still consuming him. People aren't ignoring him or marginalizing him. They're watching his videos. They're buying his albums.
But who are these people, Marc? Because we live in the United States of America that's 75% white or whatever it is.
That's fair.
Nobody is getting that famous. Nobody's going double platinum and all of that without a lot of white people buying their albums, a lot of non-Black people buying their albums. So I don't know. I guess my disconnect is this. It's not clear to me that the difference here is that there is actually more there's actually more concerted economic pressure, distancing people and not wanting to buy Kanye albums, not wanting to buy Kanye merchandise, and like sincerely not wanting to be associated with Kanye anymore because of his anti-Semitic comments versus his slavery as a choice, anti-Black comments. As much as it is, I think for potentially good reasons, people of all kind of faiths and racial backgrounds feel like what he did, that his anti-Semitic comments are actually substantively worse than the anti-Black comments for any number of reasons. Maybe it's because fundamentally we believe Holocaust denial is worse than slavery denial. Maybe it's because Jewish people have done a better job as a community at putting a stigma on Holocaust denial as opposed to slavery denial. Maybe that is in part because Holocaust denial is more of a concerted, long-term, historically rooted trope than like slavery denial as a thing, although obviously slavery has been minimized enormously in the teaching in American schools, et cetera. Yeah. But for whatever the reason, it does feel to me like it's less that people are kind of organically, they're like, Black people don't care enough about Black issues or something like that. It feels like it's something more substantive. And I don't know that I can completely divorce the power part out of it. Because if Kanye went off, but hadn't actually lost his Adidas contract and hadn't actually gotten debanked, what would the difference actually have been? It seems to me like those are the things that actually got him to sit back in his seat, right? Because he said, remember he was mouthing off at one of these interviews and he said, at the end of the day, Adidas can't get rid of me. I'm too powerful. I'm too big. He thought he was above it all. And then the next day, Adidas said, actually, no, sir.
Right,
We've reached our limit. Right.
No, that's real. I think you're right, but I don't necessarily think that that's vastly different from what I'm saying. I think you're right. I think one has been marked with a greater stigma. One has been constructed as fundamentally worse. But I think that is both a reflection of the efforts of the Jewish community, quite appropriately, I think, to add stigma to Holocaust denial, to make it an untouchable practice and topic, right? I think that's done right. I think the reason that slavery denial or anti-Blackness or misogyny is not such a topic is not just because Black people don't care enough. I think that it's hard within a white supremacist context and within this world to first normalize that narrative, because a lot of us engage in anti-Black shit. But two, to your point about power, we don't have the institutional power to impose our those values in the same way.
And that's not to say, by the way, that the people who had the power to, pull the trigger on his contracts, et cetera, were Jewish. I have no idea who those people are, but they didn't like the anti-Semitism. Like, I don't know who's the head of Adidas. I don't know who's, I mean, I guess Jamie Dimon is JP Morgan, but I don't actually know his faith background.
But that's why it's important to say that, because it's not that we're not saying, to be clear, because this will get cut out of context, we're not saying that the Jews have all the power and the Blacks don't have the power, and that's why this is happening.
Right.
It's
but the people who care
the people
are
who
caring about one thing more. The people who have power seem to care about one thing more than the other thing.
Yeah, and it's not just Jewish people who care more about these issues. It's, as a society, we have decided that Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism is a bad thing. That is correct. I'm just saying, in addition to that, we should also have space for this other thing. And the conversation you and I are having is the one that we should have been having in the broader public sphere. We should have been saying, why not just, oh, well, the Black thing didn't get blamed and the Jewish thing got blamed. That's too simplistic and reductive. As you said, it's let's talk about the whys. Let's talk about the history. Let's talk about these relationships. Let's talk about these power dynamics. Let's, because it's just very easy we just have such an extraordinary threshold for anti-Blackness and misogyny and patriarchy and all these other things.
It strikes me that there's this interesting speech undertone here, if you can just bear with me with this for a second. When we're kind of contemplating what an ideal response would be and whether or not Black people are in part responsible in some way for not trying to end Kanye's career when he said slavery was a choice, I'm sitting here thinking to myself, is the response that I would want to Kanye saying slavery is a choice, Kanye disappearing from the public sphere, Kanye not making music anymore, or at least in the short term enough so that he feels like he has to come back and apologize? Is that what I have in mind? Because how much is me, I'm continuing, Kanye says that he's still on my playlist, right? Like after he says slavery was a choice. And I don't feel as an individual like that is as an endorsement of Kanye and his beliefs. I feel like it's the reality of my college era playlists being what they are, and my nostalgia bug being what it is.
For me, it's that he imposes a material danger. For me, it's not merely like an ideological thing. It's like the R. Kelly argument, right? People say, oh, there's the relative autonomy of the artist, right? And he should be able to make his music and yada yada yada. But it's like, no, there are women actually locked up in his house right now.
Right. Well,
and every time we give him money, we're actually funding their kidnapping. We're funding their. And I'm saying with Kanye West, I think part of what makes Kanye West so dangerous is that the more power and strength he has, he's not just saying wild shit. He's also organizing on the ground politically in ways that are undermining progressive politics. He's wearing the red hat. He's running for president. He's splitting the vote, or trying to split the vote. He's making efforts to platform prominent voices that are weaponizing their dissent against us. Like he's not just somebody who says crazy stuff. And the thing, his superpower is this money. His superpower is this huge platform. And so I think for me, undermining Kanye West isn't just about having some kind of ideological purity. It's not like a virtue signal. It's like, yo, we actually need to stop. We can actually mitigate harm by taking him off the platform.
Marc, I mean, practically speaking, Kanye West running as a Republican, and I don't think there's a person in the world that would vote for him or that he would have any electoral impact whatsoever. But in a world where he does, splitting the Republican vote, splitting a MAGA vote, kudos as far as I'm concerned. I mean, do you think he's meaningfully drawing Black male voters, this voting bloc that has come under so much scrutiny because of the feeling that it's the one that's being peeled away to the right at greater numbers than Black women, at very least? Do you really think that he poses some real danger there?
I think his bigger danger is when, not at the moment where he's running in a general election, although that's its own danger for a different reason. I think his primary danger is when he's actually I think he can actually have a significant impact in mobilizing a certain sector of voters to vote Republican. I'm not worried about him splitting the Republican vote. Good for them, right? But as we saw in the general election, if he decides to run as a third party candidate again or as an independent candidate again, I do worry that there's a small slice of Black male voters that will vote for him. And in an election that could be razor thin, that could be a decider. That's not my biggest issue. That's not my biggest issue. My biggest issue is, again, his ability to mainstream and platform very dangerous ideas and to generate support for the broader Republican Party. That's actually my concern.
So this idea that, like in the R. Kelly example, these figures present a real tangible harm, not just this, words or violence kind of a harm that gets thrown around.
Right.
Something that occurs to me is that when we're talking about Holocaust denial and some of these kinds of anti-Semitism, they're also characterized as causing not just a kind of rhetorical harm,
Absolutely.
but real harm, because there's this understanding of this recurring theme of anti-Semitism that has resulted in real pogroms and holocausts and like violent assaults on Jewish people throughout history. And that kind of language is couched in those terms. And I think that is part of why we're having that kind of different public reaction, that when someone denies the Holocaust, it's part of a narrative that says doing this could cause another Holocaust. Doing this is the first step in turning around and it's a crystal knocked outside. And it's treated with that kind of weight. The anti-Blackness, misogyny, other kinds of bigotry are not spoken of that way. I would say that maybe some of the anti-trans language is akin to that and does speak to the. But I mean, what do you make of that? Is that a mistake? Like when we at the same time that there's this instinct that to maybe say, well, we should all be framing all of these issues with the gravity that the Holocaust and anti-Semitism is framed with. That's one approach you could take, but it does seem to be kind of going against this broader cultural trend that says we're awfulizing everything too much. There's too much exaggerated speech in a way that has become censorious. And now there's this conservative and sometimes mainstream pushback against some of the ratcheting up of rhetorical harms. Is that the direction that people should be trying to go in, to make everything, other kinds of claims of racial harm similar to the kinds of racial harm and ethnic and religious harm that Jewish people have established for themselves?
I think that there is a very specific kind of vulnerability that Jewish people have experienced that emerges out of anti-Semitism, various forms of Jew hate that we have to take seriously. And history does show, particularly when in context where they're a significant ethnic minority, where this type of language does have a physical, material, injurious consequence. No doubt about it. I don't want to enter a space where now every piece of speech that we disagree with about anybody and everything is seen as so high stakes that we can't actually have a conversation where people have discomfort or where people have space to be. And that's fair. That's a fair point. I get that, right? I don't want to get to that extreme, but I also don't want to ignore the very real consequences of certain types of language, not just for Jewish people, although that's significant, but also for trans people, but also for Black people. But there's this way that when it comes to Black people, we get written out of that.
And that's the that's the Dave Chappelle point. Like, I hate to keep going back to this, but this was his poorly executed thesis from that last stand-up routine.
Yeah.
The poorly executed thesis was not, again, poorly executed, but not necessarily that trans people should be treated with less dignity, although he certainly treated them with not a lot of dignity in the stand-up. Yes. I can't say that enough. But that why is it that the same energy isn't being brought to Black people? And I don't know that you can put that squarely on. I mean, I'm not trying to absolve Black people of responsibility, but it's a shared reality that, like, especially talking in the United States of America in this context, it does feel a little weird to say it is appropriate, and I don't think it's inappropriate, but that it's appropriate to treat anti-Semitism with the gravity that we do because of the fear of another Holocaust or because of a 2,000-year history of persecution. But Black people in the United States of America, given our very proximate and immediate traumas in this country that are very much rooted right here in this country, shouldn't similarly have that same level of energy brought to claims of anti-Blackness or moments of anti-Blackness. And right. So either we live in a world where those two things are treated unequally and Black claims continue to go kind of unrecognized, at least in the eyes of a lot of Black people, and underweighted. Or we live in a world where we ratchet everything up or we ratchet everything down. And I think both of those alternatives make people uncomfortable for different reasons.
I think that's right. And that's why I think we need to approach this with nuance, right? Some things need to be ratcheted up. Other things, I don't think necessarily things need to be ratcheted down as much as we need to make sure that we're being intellectually honest and principled in our response. I'll give you an example. There's a way that, yeah, this conversation about anti-Semitism is a significant one. And we do have to be honest about the fact that, you know, anti-Semitic discourse, anti-Semitic language does lead to violence. And we have to be mindful of that so that we never repeat not just the Holocaust, but any moment in history where Jewish people have been persecuted.
We've had the tree of
Life synagogue in Pittsburgh. Yeah.
There was this this year that had that horrible manifesto.
Yeah.
Don't look at the manifesto. So this isn't even just historical. But the issue is we also have the grocery store shooting in Buffalo. I mean, these things are happening all at the same time, at the same time.
But also we have to look at the power dynamic, right? And the political power dynamics I'm talking about, because there's also a way that the language of anti-Semitism and the framing of what constitutes anti-Semitism has been so much shaped in relationship to Israeli policy that it's very difficult to have a critique of the state of Israel without also being called anti-Semitic and being told that this type of critique, or as one person referred to Israel as an apartheid state and was fired, another person, that this type of language is dangerous because it leads to harm. And so you could end up in a space where you can't say anything, and we can't even have the conversation about why a critique of Israel isn't inherently anti-Semitic without being told that you're denying anti-Semitism or that you're trying to explain it away, or you're not listening to the voices of the marginal. And so you end up in this kind of bizarre world where we can't have a sophisticated conversation about things or a principled dissent about something. And that's what worries me.
Well, maybe this is a good moment to talk a little bit about the Kyrie Irving situation in Black Israelites, generally speaking, and I think
they like to be called Hebrew Israelites, not Black
Israelites. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Because part of what we're talking about now, where there's been this simmering feeling of neglect by Black people, from Black people, about how our racial claims are treated differently in this country from other groups. My feeling is that part of the reason why Hebrew Israelites offer an attraction to some folks, especially people like Kyrie Irving, who has a long history of kind of being a counterculture thinker. He was dabbling in the flat eartherness of it all, somehow feeling like it feels like he's looking for some moorings or something. Something. It feels to me like part of the appeal is a kind of ideology that centers Black people and Black claims, not just in the United States, but as part of a broader historical narrative in exactly the way that Judaism is, because it's literally saying that Black people are Jewish, are the real Jews. And it feels almost like a self-esteem grab, a way to equalize this kind of tension that we've been discussing so far between the perception, at least, by a lot of folks in the Black community that our claims aren't given the same amount of weight. And that I won't use the word sympathy, but the appeal seems clear to me, despite it having these anti-Semitic valences and being problematic for people who are more traditionally understood as being Jewish. So maybe we should back up a little bit.
That's a great point. Daniel, thank you. That's a great conversation. And that's, again, one of the conversations that we had an opportunity to have, but that will require us to have a sense of history. It will require us to be honest about these traditions, to talk about what you just said, the backdrop of this, which is that Black folk have been searching for an identity and trying to understand their roots and their lineage, largely because of the violence of slavery. And that the legitimacy of some of those claims are completely dismissed because people focus on the kind of excesses and the spectacle of the more problematic parts. So it's easy to say, okay, these Israelites are crazy, they're sexist, they're anti-Semitic, they're anti-African, they're this, they dress like Power Rangers. Like, you could go on down the list of stuff and say, all right, so because of that, I don't have to actually reckon with some of the claims they're making, right? I also don't have to make distinctions between and among various Hebrew Israelite groups and I don't have to have a more robust conversation about Black Jewry more broadly, because these are all things that we have to be able to do. They just say, "Oh no, Kyrie's crazy. That movie's anti-Semitic. That's it." Now, let me stipulate again: that movie is anti-Semitic. That Hebrews to Negroes is deep. It has Holocaust denial in it. It fundamentally denies the Jewishness of large swaths of the Jewish diaspora, particularly the Ashkenazim.
What does it say? Because we've been through this a little bit on. I've been talking about it a little bit on Rising. I went to watch it myself. It was $40. I got derailed because I didn't want to pay $40. But let's set this up a little bit. So Kyrie Irving, who plays for the Nets, the Brooklyn Nets, tweeted a link without context to this movie that has these themes in it. Has been broadly described as anti-Semitic. When asked about it, he said, I learned from all the different faiths. I learned from a lot of different things. I'm not endorsing everything in the movie. And because, when you know where you're from, you can't be anti-Semitic, implying that he believes that he is Jewish as well, and therefore cannot be
Israelite.
Anti-Semitic.
And
an Israelite.
And that's a very similar claim to what Kanye was saying just a few days prior, even on Piers Morgan, where he said, I am, I'm Black people are the real Jews, we come from the blood of Christ. He didn't understand. The problem is Kanye West doesn't read things, right? He doesn't know things. So he just hears little bits and pieces, collects them, and then spits them back out. Yeah. And so he was trying to basically articulate a Black Israelite, and I'm saying now I'm using Black Israelite in a very specific way. The claims of Israelites who also identify as Black, or Israelite claims about Blackness. But he didn't understand it. And I don't know the extent to which Kyrie fully knows that either. But what I know is Kyrie tweeted a movie. I don't know if he watched it. I don't know if he endorses it, but I think he was trying to learn and understand it. And I think that's a huge difference between Kanye and Kyrie. I don't think Kyrie is actually anti-Semitic. I think he posted something that he shouldn't have, and then kind of doubled down when challenged. And because some of the penalties and punishments that were imposed on him seemed excessive to folk, it created space for him to say, yo, I'm being mistreated here, even if I made a mistake and apologize for it, even if his apology was fraught with all these kind of fits and starts, which is a different piece of the conversation. But to get to the heart of it, at the very least, Kyrie Irving was posting a link to a movie that supports the ideology of one of the more mainstream Hebrew Israelite sects. And it's important to understand that there's a long tradition of Black people identifying with the Old Testament, with the Hebrew Bible, with the Torah, with the tribes of Israel, with the children of Israel. These are all narratives that Black people across time and religious time and space have done. If you look at the Nation of Islam, they're often preaching an Exodus narrative. Eddie Glaude has a wonderful book, his first book actually, called Exodus, which talks about the kind of relationship that Black people have to the Exodus narrative in general, even in Black Christendom, right? When we talk about slavery, how we've attempted to make sense of our identities and our world, and in some ways, a kind of what we call a kind of theodicy, a kind of way of understanding and reconciling this nation, this notion of God and this notion of kind of justice, right? And the goodness of God is to say, look, we are sojourning here. We're in Egypt, right? But we're the children of Israel, but we will be free. We will leave our bondage. And so our relationship to that has always been part of our Black religious thought, Black eschatology, sort of how we think about the end of days, how we think about our lives, how we think about the penultimate and the ultimate, how we think about our lives in this world and what the hereafter looks like. The Nation of Islam has done that. Almost every Black religious group has engaged these stories of the children of Israel and these histories, what the Hebrew Israelite tradition has done, as well as the tradition of Black Jews, which are separate, but in some ways overlapping, is say that this is not merely a kind of metaphorical connection, but rather we are saying that the original tribes of Israel were dark people, that it wasn't white people. This is their argument. This wasn't white people in Egypt in captivity, right? They weren't in Northeast Africa locked up, North Africa locked up, right? So and it's the same argument that the nation made and other people made about Jesus being Black, right? I mean, these are all kind of arguments that people make that we're them, that people of African descent are those tribes. We are those people, and we are the lost tribe, right? We're somehow over here. So then there comes some claims around lineage, some interpretive claims about who is what. But at the core, the idea is to say that the tribe of Judah, right, is Black folk, right?
So why then, if there are these parallels, if folks trying to find themselves in these big three religious texts, and Black people in particular, Black Americans in particular, having this craving for an origin story because of the legacy of slavery?
Yeah.
Why are Black Hebrew Israelites perceived to be anti-Semitic? What is it about their claim to this story that is perceived as usurping Jewish people's rights to that same story in a way that seems like violent and hostile, in a way that every religion disagrees with every other religion? They all think each other is wrong. That's why they're not each other's religions. So what makes the Hebrew Israelites different in the eyes of Jewish people?
So it's an interesting question. One, I would hasten to add that there is not one particular sect of Hebrew Israelites. For example, the people we see yelling at Times Square or at Philadelphia in the Clothespin or any major city, they represent a very particular tradition. They often are the ISUPK or the Israel, the IUIC, or they are, back in the 80s and 90s, it was like they were called the Israelite Church or the Israeli Church. But these are groups that have a very particular approach to the Israelite tradition. These are the ones that are yelling on street corners. These are the ones with the microphones. And they're saying that the 12 tribes of Israel represent 12 kind of distinct ethnicities. Like this group, people from Puerto Rico are this, people from the Blacks in the United States are that, people from this part of the diaspora are there. They're denying Africa as home in a certain kind of way. They're saying we're not African, we are Israelites, and our 12 tribes can be divided. Chad is here, Judah is here, Levi is here, Levi is here, excuse me, and they're saying that this is who we are. That's not the only tradition. There are Hebrew Israelites, like the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, who clearly identify with Africa, who live in Israel. They live in Dimona. They live in the Negev, and they have a very different relationship to the Israeli state and to the Ashkenazi Jews, the Sephardic Jews, to Mizrahi Jews, etc. But so I don't ever want to paint everyone with an entire brush, but there are some unifying claims, and that's what you're getting at. The thing that makes people say they're anti-Semitic is not that they are asserting their own lineage to the tribe of Judah and Judea, right? Again, speaking now about historic Palestine and that area, both think about Judea and Samaria, the region that we call the West Bank, but these people don't just identify with the tradition in the land. They're also making claims about the non-Jewishness of European Jews, right? They're saying we're the real Jews, even though they don't use the language Jews. They say we're Hebrew Israelites because they're saying that even the title Jew itself is a more recent sort of construct, and that their traditions and their rights precede even the formalization of Judaism, particularly rabbinic Judaism. So they would say, look, rabbinical Judaism. So they would say, look, no, we're Israelites. We come from the tribe we're one of the lost tribes of Israel. We come from Judah. So we're Jewish to the extent that we come from Judah, but we're the real ones. And those people over there, they're saying that European Jews, that the Ashkenazim, are not real, that they're fake Jews, that they are that they don't have the right to the tradition, and their own eschatology, their own sort of understanding of how sort of history is going to move toward the end of days is that the real Jews at some point will come back and take over, right? And so, similar to evangelical Christians, they don't have a very positive sort of expectation of how the world's going to work for
everyone else. But that's what I'm kind of driving at. I'm not trying to be provocative any more so than usual. But as a agnostic, when I'm really trying to read this and understand it and respect it. There's a great write-up in Jewish Currents that I was reading by the religion reporter from, I think, the Washington Post. And he's being interviewed and he's explaining that, like what you're saying, that there's this claim that Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Mizrahi Jews are imposters stealing the legacy, and that that's what's anti-Semitic about it.
Yes.
But as an
and they deny the Holocaust, and they often deny the Holocaust and say explicitly everything's not this sort of abstract shit. Some of it is like they actually deny the Holocaust, or
that's cut and dry. I mean,
right? That's what I'm saying. Or they say like the UI, one of these groups, the IUIC says like, oh, I believe the Holocaust, and they endorse Hitler, right? They're pro-Hitler, right?
Yeah, I mean it's
awful. It's disgusting.
There's no defense of that. But the part of it where it's like the being of, I think for someone like, let's say you're right about Kyrie and that he's just kind of stumbled into this and he's exploring things much like he explored the curvature of the earth or lack thereof.
Right.
There's a way that you can see that the ideology itself, if the claim that thinking that you were the real Jewish people isn't of itself anti-Semitic. As an agnostic, it feels to me a lot like Jewish people saying that they're chosen one, Christians saying that if you don't accept Lord Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, you're going to hell. Everybody basically tells you if you're not in the club, you're going to hell.
Right. Here's the problem. Here's the difference, right?
Okay, tell me.
They're not just making a theological argument, right? They're not just making a hermeneutical claim about the text. They're not just saying the Bible says this or that.
Uh-huh.
They're making, and also Jewishness isn't just a faith identity. It's not just a religion, right? Mm-hmm. It's also an ethnic identity. It's also, particularly in the context of Zionists, it's also a kind of national identity, right? And so denying someone's Jewishness is how can I explain? It's beyond just saying I have a different religious take than you do. If they were to say that Ethiopians, the Beta Israel, right, the Ethiopian Jews were the original Jews, or that their forms of Jewish practice, which is temple worship as opposed to rabbinical Judaism, is the oldest, and they are the most original Jews, nobody, I don't think, would say that's anti-Semitic. Or if they did, they'd be hard-pressed to have that claim supported by history, because you can make a historical claim about that. But when I start to say that you're not something, right? Even if I could make a lineage argument that I am older, to deny your, it would be like me telling a biracial, no, it's not the perfect example. If I tell biracial people, you ain't black, right? You're not as black as me, right? There comes a moment where that's not just me asserting a kind of biological claim of saying, well, I may have a greater percentage of this or more of my family is that. I'm making an ideological claim about your blackness. I'm making a claim about your belonging. I'm making a claim against your identity. And when
absolutely. But people do that all the time. I don't know if you've been watching this discourse around the Meghan Markle documentary.
That's true. That's fair enough. Fair enough.
We are very comfortable telling people they are and are not black.
That's very true. But, and the other piece of this, though, is that it also plays on very long-standing anti-Semitic tropes of Jewish sneakiness, of Jewish conspiracy. It's not just that they came along. It's that they say that these are European converts who are now sort of stealing the legacy and the tradition and the mantle of Jewishness, and they're excluding other. And so it becomes this grand narrative of what other people are not. And in ways that actually, again, the same people that are saying these ain't real ones and they don't count are also the ones saying the Holocaust didn't happen or the Holocaust was okay. So again, it's hard. This is what I said at the beginning. It's hard to have any sort of legitimate, interesting anthropological or historical conversation about lineage, right? Because I could talk about the Limba people, in West Africa. I could talk about groups where we have the Kohen line. We could talk about very interesting claims about the popping up of Jewish tradition that goes back thousands and thousands and thousands of years on the continent of Africa. We could talk about that, but the problem is, again, the wrong people are talking about it. And by wrong, I mean...
That's the thing. No one's talking about it at this point because the way it's written up, I was reading Michael Eric Dyson wrote a piece in the Times about the Kyrie stuff. And, he characterizes the tweet itself, Kyrie's tweet, as endorsing all the anti-Semitic tropes in the video. You have Van Jones giving the speech in front of I believe it was a Jewish group recently, saying that he basically kind of apologizes, or that, he not apologizes on behalf of Black America, but it's sorry that Black Americans haven't apologized more.
Right, and that we didn't.
You can parse that.
That we didn't stop it soon enough. That we let the slow drip turn into the Kanye flood.
I am going to start off with an apology for the silence of my community and for the speech of my profession. When we were hit as a Black community with appalling anti-Black bigotry and racism that the whole world saw on a video, we expected and insisted that everyone stand and roar back against that hatred. People did. By the tens of millions, people marched in a pandemic by the tens of millions, non-Black people, to say we will not accept this sort of racism, this sort of violence, this sort of hatred on this planet. People marched by the millions. And yet, as this wave of hatred has been building against your community, we have rationalized over and over and over again, responding not with a roar, but often with barely a squeak and sometimes a shrug. As a result, we now have the shock to you, the pain to you, and the humiliation to us of having an African-American icon praising Hitler and Nazis, and we act like we don't know where the hatred came from. And I want to say very clearly, when it was a drip, we did not turn it off. And now it is a flood. And I want to say to you, I apologize for the silence of my community. The silence is over. And I want to say to Kanye, who I know, yay, nay. Yay, nay.
I'm sorry I didn't lasso Kanye with my Wonder Woman.
Right.
Invisible lasso or whatever. I've been saying, I will say this. Kanye has been making objections about the Democratic Party for a long time and has showed some sparks. I think there's also mental health and other things going on here, but had shown some sparks of interest and independence in a left direction. Yeah. I remember him going on Rogan saying Bernie would have won and saying what the Democratic Party did to him was wrong.
The Democrats were willing to take the chance of not winning as long as the conglomerate could be completely in control of, completely in control. You know what I'm saying that? Bernie.
Yeah.
Bernie would have won.
He would have won.
This is something I wore a Trump hat. I'm saying Bernie is a superhero.
Yeah.
And
he would be the perfect person to be the opposite of what Trump represents.
Yeah.
He's an anti-capitalist. He's a guy who's a social democrat.
But you know the problem? They couldn't control Bernie. Because
no, you can't control him. He's been so consistent his whole life.
And so what I'm saying is they literally kicked. If this doesn't say something, it's like they kicked the superhero.
But leftists hate it when someone agrees with them. And conservatives will take the tiniest sliver of agreement and say, come on, honey.
Right.
Get in the pool. The water is great.
Right. Very true.
And I think that's a little bit what happened.
I mean, I don't think Hitler was a good guy. I get the Hugo Boss uniforms, amazing. But I mean, just because you're in love with the design, you're a designer. Can we just kind of say you like the uniforms, but that's about it?
There's a lot of things that I love about Hitler.
So we could be living in a different alternative universe here. So I want to make that mark in the sand. But generally speaking, we're living in a world where I think a lot of Black folks, perhaps a little performatively, have gone out of their way to say, this is wrong, this is a problem, this is anti-Semitic, and Black people themselves haven't done enough. And I do think that there's a world where, you're right, we could be having a different conversation about why is this appealing to Kyrie Irving? Is there a way to fulfill the desire that these people seem to be longing for without endorsing belief systems that are so openly anti-Semitic and Holocaust denying and things like that?
Right.
Because
And those traditions exist, and that's what I want us to engage. I'm finishing a documentary right now where I spend a solid 25 minutes of the movie, but I spent a great deal of time of the last 8 years with the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem. And again, there will be people who will have opposition to their claims, particularly their early kind of theologies when they moved to Israel in 1968. But
well, what was wrong with what was the objection to their early claims?
Well, I think that they had a lot of the "we're the real Jew" kind of narrative as they arrived in Israel. They started in Chicago. Ben Ami Ben Israel, formerly known as Ben Ami Carter or Ben Carter, and they moved to Liberia for a year. And then they go to Israel, and they're going to Israel initially under the right of return law, right, which was established in 1950 that allowed returning Jews to come home for citizenship. And the laws have been revised multiple times. In some ways, that expanded the doors of entry. For example, to like Russian immigrants. For example, you don't have to be halachically Jewish necessarily to be enter. In other words, you could have a, for example, if my father is Jewish, not my mother, I'm not technically Jewish in that way. I mean, at least in Orthodox traditions, but I could make Aliyah. I could still become an Israeli citizen now, whereas in 1950 I couldn't. The law's been edited to allow the entry of more European Jews into the country, right? Mm-hmm. But those laws were written in ways that also kind of wrote out these Black Israelites that came in. And when you look, for example, at the Beta Israel again, and we can talk about the Falash Mora as well in Ethiopia. They didn't make it in until the 1980s during the famine and war and during Operation Moses and Solomon, but there were still debates about their Jewishness, right? Because of and they were being asked to convert. They were being asked to do things, as were the Israelites. But this group, when they come, they said, we're not going to convert, because to convert would mean to concede that we're not who we said we were, right?
Right. You're not ethnically Jewish in the first place.
Right. And that our traditions precede yours, they're saying. So we're not going to convert to you. We're not going to.
Although Amari Stoudemire is an interesting counterexample where he both subscribes to some version of Hebrew Israelite-ism, but did also convert and holds those two things in tandem.
He is seen as the example of a bad boy going good, right? That he practiced the wrong type of tradition, Hebrew Israelites, then he actually became the Department of Aliyah, as I understand it, because the rabbinate controls the immigration of the Aliyah department, that they determine that he is eligible for citizenship and that he is a legitimate converted Jew at this point. But he's the minority. Most of the folk, the Israelites who moved to southern Israel, to Dimona, didn't do that. And so they were never able to get citizenship. But they stayed and they fought. And then their children joined the IDF. Mm-hmm. And then because the children joined the IDF, they were able to get citizenship after having permanent residency. But they had to fight for it, and they're still seen as outliers. And the state that once rejected them, and they had to have this big standoff in the 80s, now loves them. They see them as a pearl in the desert. They see them as an asset. Their children are in the military. They're promoting veganism. They got one of the most famous rappers in the country is a Hebrew Israelite. I mean, there's a very specific thing. The Ethiopians are allowed in, and they do serve in the military. They serve, some are in the Knesset. They have jobs, but there's still tons of racism. They're still marginalized, but they are seen as Jewish, although they're not fighting real hard to let more of them in. If there's a bunch of them who were left behind, the Falesh Mura, who aren't allowed in. So these are the conversations I was talking about Blackness and both Judaism, Black Jewry, but also the Israelite traditions, where we're not talking about race. And all of this, when we talk about Black and Jewish relations, we're acting as if there are no Black Jews, even in the United States, when there's a long tradition of Black Jews. If you look at, and there's some prominent voices. There are rabbis, there are just cultural critics, there are writers, there are, who are Black and Jewish.
Rat Pack singers,
right? Exactly. And I wasn't even thinking about, but they also fly in the face of other narratives, because everyone who's Ashkenazi isn't like, there are Black Ashkenazi, right? There are, so just even to distinguish them and say, oh, the Ashkenazim are all Europeans, although they typically are, and the Sephardim are all, from, South America, or from, brown places. They're all from, this place, or that the Mizraim are just the Arab. It's a little more complicated than that, but we're not able to talk about that. 20%, more than 20%.
But I want to talk about why we're not able to talk about that, because that was kind of where we started.
Yeah.
And again, I'm sorry, I have my dumb, not religious person brain, but I'm thinking like, okay, the Mormons pop up, and they're like, Jesus Christ came to Colorado or whatever it is. I'm sorry, I apologize. It's been a long time since I saw the Book of Mormon. But like they create their whole.
I hope you don't get your Mormon theology from the Book of Mormon, which was an amazing show, but probably not where you would get the theology from.
I don't know anything about anything, and I completely own my ignorance here. But whatever the American located origin story and the American West with the plate and all of this stuff, which seems deeply ahistorical and crazy. I mean, like, a lot of religion seems wacky, but if you said it long ago enough, everything gets to be a little bit more plausible and mystic. This being more recent, this being set in America, a lot of people look at Mormonism and roll their eyes. But the idea of them thinking that they're the chosen people and that God came down and gave them stuff, nobody sees that as a threat. I mean, I won't say nobody, because obviously Mormons have been persecuted and
for sure,
and they've gone through it. But it doesn't. You are allowed, at least today, after those challenges, to kind of coexist and not think that Mormons pose any real threat to whatever mainstream Christians believe, and vice versa.
But Mormons aren't out there. Mormons aren't organizing to take anyone else down.
But this is what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
If you're telling me that there's a power, a rising, growing, powerful group of Hebrew Israelites that are posing a real threat, who am I to say that that's not something that someone should be concerned about? But what it does feel like a little bit is that some of the way that ethnicity, race, belonging is being policed here, it has to have some kind of relationship. Even when you're talking about the Ethiopian Jews, it seems to have a really specific relationship to claims, not just these abstract claims of belonging to a religion, or spiritual claims, I should say, of belonging to a religion, but kind of national claims of belonging and your ability to actually go to Israel and lay claim to that very disputed territory. Am I wrong to be reading into some of this a kind of need to police who and who isn't Jewish for those kinds of reasons?
So I mean, it's an interesting question, right? And certainly I think in 1948, we would say that the boundaries of Jewishness were smaller, partly for that reason, right? And there's some interesting research on this that talks about this, right? That there's a way that to achieve whiteness and a kind of purified whiteness, the Israeli state had to have a certain kind of racial hierarchy, to develop as a certain kind of racial state. But then there's also the demographic reality that by expanding the boundaries of the citizenry and the demographic boundaries of Jewishness, not outside of Jewish law, I'm not suggesting that, but certainly to say that, okay, we're going to make sure that Moroccans came before to say that we're going to make sure that Ethiopians are here. We're going to make sure that settlers come from the states. We're going to make sure that so-and-so comes. It increases the power of the state itself. And so it's not that we're going to have everybody here be European and white, but there's still going to be a racial hierarchy within this. I think there is something to be said about that. And I think that who has access matters. And I think that's why, it was a struggle. I mean, now it becomes a heroic tale of kind of solidarity when Operation Moses happened, Operation Solomon happened, and even Operation Joshua happened, when Ethiopians are airlifted from Addis and other places to Tel Aviv, and they were allowed to make Aliyah, they were allowed to get citizenship. That becomes a heroic tale. But one, there was a huge debate about whether that should happen or not. Two, when they got there, they were put in absorption centers, and many had to convert again. Their Jewishness was not accepted, and it stood in sharp contrast to Russian Jewish immigrants who came and hit the ground running as soon as they landed. Neither spoke the language, neither had kind of direct familial ties there, but one was seen as an outside threat, one wasn't. In the Knesset, there were debates about everything from disease spread to, cleanliness of these people. This was not a Russian critique. This was an Ethiopian critique. That was, and so it is about the boundaries of who gets to be Jewish is about who gets to be in the Jewish state, but it's not just that. I think there are legitimate theological claims that the Jewish community is engaged in. I think that there are legitimate conversations about what it means to expand or shrink the boundaries of Jewishness for political reasons versus others. Because even there are many Orthodox Jewish traditions and strands that are in direct opposition to the Israeli state itself because of how it operates with regard to Jewish law. So it's a very complicated and messy set of waters that we have to wade through. But I think when it comes to the Israelite traditions, I'm not convinced that that's the primary goal, because most of the Israelites that we see, again, with the exception of the Ben Ami, Ben Israel community people that actually, the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem who moved to Dimona, with the exception of them, the other groups ain't trying to go to Israel. You know, Yahweh Ben Yahweh's people in Florida weren't trying to go to Israel. You know, Dr. York's Nubian Islamic Hebrews in Bushwick and in upstate New York in the 80s and 90s, they weren't trying to go to Israel. I've never seen any of these ISUPK, IUS say we're going to make Aliyah, we're going to try and go to Israel. Their goal is to expand, at least as I understand it, to expand their communities here, to grow knowledge of self in their communities here. So for them, Israel isn't the primary goal for them. It's not necessarily home for them. Whereas with some of these other groups, Africa is home, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they see Israel as an extension of Africa. They frame Israel as Northeast Africa sitting on the African tectonic plate, and so they're making sort of archaeological claims, not about their Jewishness, but about their Hebrew Israeliteness and their Africanness, and they're trying to identify and resurrect that tradition. So there's all kinds of different pieces and ways of thinking about belonging. So for the group in Israel, they're trying to connect to the rest of us African people, right? They're saying, look, we're going to talk to Senegalese, we're going to talk to Ghanaians, we're going to talk to blacks in Brooklyn. Whereas these folk on the street corners of Times Square, they're like, we're not African, you know, we ain't trying to be African. You know, Africans that they're literally holding pictures of pagan Africans and dirty Africans. They're replicating some of the whites. They sound like Nazis. You know,
in more ways than one.
In all the ways, right? So this was it's complicated, and we wiped them all with one brush and said Israelites are evil. Kanye's anti-Semitic. Kyrie might be, and I think that all of those conversations can be had, but they have to be had with nuance and detail, or else we write out a whole lot of folk, including, I'm gonna say this again before I go, the Black Jewish people right here in the United States. They're not Israelites. They're not Beit Israel. They are Negroes like me who have practiced Judaism for decades and for centuries. You go back to the commandment keepers. You go back to Rabbi Wentworth right here. I mean, there's such a long and deep tradition of just Black Jews here in the States that we just pretend they don't exist.
And, as long as that tradition is, the kind of tension has also existed. I mean, I appreciated that in Michael Eric Dyson's article. He opens with this anecdote with Rabbi Everett Gendler asking Dr. Martin Luther King at a meeting of the Rabbinical Assembly in 1968, 10 days before King was murdered, what effective measures will the collective Negro community take against vicious anti-Semitism? And King responded that Black anti-Semitism was largely a Northern ghetto experience driven by the harsh contrast between Jews as the, quote, most consistent and trusted ally in the struggle for justice, and Jews as the, quote, owner of the store around the corner, where he pays more for what he gets, and landlords who charge a color tax. And King went on to condemn the rational statements that were anti-Semitic and all of this. But that does seem to be this, it's like this closeness that is, familiarity breeds contempt.
Yeah, we saw that in LA with Koreans. Same thing happened in LA with Korean store owners in the 90s. I mean, there's huge debates and conversations about that whenever there's, and we can say the same thing in Detroit with Arab store owners. I mean, George Floyd is killed right outside of a store owned by Palestinian, right? And so there's a way that some of these relationships that we are resenting, some of these experiences that we're lamenting, are the outgrowth of capitalism. It's not the outgrowth of it's like when Kanye says, these Jewish Hollywood executives are exploiting us. Hollywood is exploitative.
Right.
And if it's
so close, Kanye.
Right. It's like you're almost there, but you're blaming it on their Jewishness and not on their Hollywood executiveness or their Diddy is known for giving people shitty record deals just as much as any Jewish record label owner. It's not being Jewish doesn't make you a bad boss or an untrustworthy person. It's being in this industry and operating within the interest and logic of capitalism. And so, but because of so much sort of virulent anti-Semitism, we've decided to blame it on them being Jewish and not the fact that it's just the system itself. And anybody, Jewish, Jew, Gentile, black, white, red, yellow, is often, if they operate in that system, are going to be part of the exploitative process. And that's the part that we need to have a conversation about. But instead, Kanye's like, look, I'm getting exploited by Jews in Hollywood and in music, and people are saying that's not true. And he's like, but look, there's all these people here. And we didn't unpack it to show that it is anti-Semitic, but also there's a critique of capitalism that would actually help us understand how this is happening.
Yes. which is why when Kanye was signaling to Bernie, someone should have swooped in there and pointed him in the right direction. I will say that I listened to the whole Piers Morgan interview. Yes. And what was really striking to me about it was that he kept trying to have the conversation about exploitation in the music industry.
Right.
And Piers Morgan kept trying to be the one that secured the apology for the anti-Semitism. Understandably so.
Because Kanye kept doubling down on it though, right?
He did. But here's the thing that happened during the interview that became apparent was Kanye basically said explicitly at one point, every time I admit I was wrong, every time I apologize for the anti-Semitism, the conversation ends. And I want people to stay focused on the Hollywood exploitation. And Piers goes, no. I totally get that. But like, you admit that you were wrong about the anti-Semitism, right? And Kanye's like, yeah, man, I should have phrased that differently. And he's like, all right, meeting wrapped. We'll see you next week on the show. Immediately after 2 hours.
My question for you is, do you now regret saying DEFCON 3 on Jewish people? Are you sorry you said that?
No.
I don't think it matters. You should be.
Absolutely not. You know, I will say I'm sorry for the people that I hurt with the DEFCON, the confusion that I call. I feel like I cause hurt and confusion.
Yeah. It's an uncensored interview. You said something which you've now wished you hadn't said, and you've apologized. I actually think that says a lot about you.
And Kanye looked kind of crestfallen. Now, this is not an apology. This is not an excuse making for, you shouldn't use hate against another group as a way to draw attention to your pet project in record company land or whatever. But I will say that if the goal is to get him to stop, I do think there's something to be said about creating space to have the conversation that he's having very untactfully and wrongly, without the anti-Semitism aspect of it, because I think that he is feeling like, and a lot of people are feeling like, there's no room for any of that substantive critique, because the substantive critique itself of the industry might also be characterized as anti-Semitism. And there's that kind of like slipperiness that sometimes happens when we're critiquing power and establishment and all these other kinds of things. All about the Benjamins, all of that we've seen happen. But anyway, I want to thank you so much for your time. You've been so generous. And can you tell the people listening, Marc, where to find you, your upcoming documentary, and any other work?
Yeah. So I have a show called The Griot, which I'm actually going to go record right now. It's called The Griot with Marc Lamont Hill. It's on the Griot Network. Check your cable listings. It's on every cable outlet. We come on 7 p.m. Eastern every single night, Monday to Friday. So check me out. We just had a wonderful conversation on Black Jewish identity. I think it airs this week. We had some great people on. But beyond that, you can find me on social media. I'm on all the platforms for now. I haven't done my long dramatic exit sequence from Twitter like everyone else. So I will be there. I'll be there for the foreseeable future. It's just at Marc Lamont Hill. The documentary is called Black in the Holy Land. It will be out, inshallah, as we say, by the summer. And I'm very excited about it. And I have a book that's out right now called Seen and Unseen: Race, Technology, Social Media Technology and the Fight for Racial Justice. So make sure you check that out too. And a lot more coming. I'm working hard, and I'm just trying to make things happen. So everybody just follow me on social media and stay up to date.
It sounds like you're a busy man. Thank you again, Marc. We appreciate you.
My pleasure. Take care.
Take care. And as always, thank you for listening. If you would like even more Bad Faith, you can subscribe for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast and get an additional premium episode every single Monday. That's video and audio. We really appreciate your support in helping to fund independent media and interviews like this one. So if you enjoyed, consider becoming a patron. And if that's not in the wheelhouse and the cards for you right now, go over to Bad Faith YouTube, where we put clips of all the premium episodes up, about 20 to 30 minutes every week. And do like and subscribe to that channel. It helps boost us in the algorithm and get more eyes on this content. So thanks again. Take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.